And let's put into our model
some kind of parallel universe.
we're talking about statistics, about probability.
This is the biggest liar in algo trading.
I don't guarantee it.
Over-optimization.
A person is actually fighting with themselves.
While you're looking at the chart, getting nervous, reading the news, and doubting whether to enter a trade, the algorithm has already calculated everything, opened a position, and taken the profit. Machines have long been pushing emotions out of the exchange, but who is behind these trading systems and who do they actually bring money to? Today, our guest on the xChief Central Asia podcast is Roman Svetli, an experienced full-stack developer, an algorithmic programmer with many years of experience in creating trading algorithms and automated systems. He specializes in developing solutions on MQL5 and is actively involved in the development of algorithmic trading and the ecosystem of quantitative research 5 QR5. Roman, tell me honestly, as a developer, does an ordinary person with a mouse still have a chance to compete with algorithms today? Or is the market really moving more and more towards automation? How big is this difference now?
The difference is indeed significant. That is, if we look at what it was like before, well, let's say 10 or 20 years ago, and what is happening on the market now, these are two big differences. Why? Because if before robots didn't influence market movement so much, now this influence is particularly noticeable. And then the question arises, how can a person actually really compete with a machine? But nevertheless, robots are also being created that play chess. But nevertheless, chess players still win periodically. And therefore, a chance remains. But if you imagine, for example, I don't know, if in medicine it's a pulse, right? And if in the market it's a price movement chart, then we can imagine that if before it was like a neurotic person whose blood pressure is constantly jumping, whose pulse is jumping or something else, well, now it's simply impossible to predict their behavior. Therefore, yes, indeed, people think they are the smartest. Yes, they have a desire to compete with a robot and compete with the market, but as a rule, they get disappointed quite quickly. And in such conditions, when market movement is caused precisely by the influence of a huge number of robots, the chances are quite small.
Okay, then a question arises for me right away. How then is a trading robot fundamentally different from manual trading? What is this difference and how can we distinguish it?
Well, look, let's look at two options. So, manual trading and the robot. Naturally, it's best to start with manual trading because people think they're the smartest, that they know what they're doing, and that they'll get lucky. Well, since a human is in fact a kind of biomechanism that's wired in such a way that if they win, they tend to take all the credit for themselves, but if they lose, it's almost always someone else's fault. And so those who don't prepare properly before they start trading, they get frustrated and disappointed very quickly. And that's no surprise because a person is actually fighting against themselves. And if they take a step, even just a single step, that leads to pain and dissatisfaction, then they suffer physically, experiencing discomfort in their bodies. We can see this not only in movies where characters make choices that bring them pain, but also in real life all around us. For example, there are people who try to trade on the financial markets, hoping to make a profit, but instead they become neurotics, overwhelmed by stress and anxiety, and they become a significant burden to their families, and their sleep and all other vital functions are significantly disrupted. I mean, the person is completely broken. And that's not a very good outcome. And so we should be getting real pleasure and enjoyment from our trading and from what we do. Just like at the school of Epicurus, there was a wonderful inscription saying that pleasure is the ultimate meaning. So if you're enjoying it, that's great. If you're in pain, that's not so good. And I want to say that if a person starts trading and they're incredibly lucky, then maybe they'll succeed. Later on, if there's an opportunity, I'll talk about some interesting experiments that were done and some quite unusual ways to trade. So if we're talking about manual control, it's the very first stage that probably everyone goes through. I mean, what's so hard? You look at it and it's just like when artists paint and you think, oh, how hard can it be to paint that? But when you try to paint it yourself, for some reason, it turns out to be total nonsense. We all remember, for example, the scene with Ostap Bender when he was an artist and tried to paint Kisavorobianino from one artist to another. In principle, let's say, there aren't that many talented people, but there are many who want to be. And so the question arises, who gets lucky and who doesn't? Well, something like that.
All right. Then let me ask a question. Are there any situations in today's world where a human being is simply more effective or perhaps more efficient than an algorithm?
Well, no.
Or is it impossible?
We've just come to that very point, and it reminds me of a case where they actually trained rats to trade. And so, well, a former financier, an Austrian artist, his name was also Michael Markovici, he decided to conduct an experiment, and he had a goal. What if, let's say, we teach rats who are free from emotions, who are free from rumors, who are free from any kind of worries, well, and an excess of intelligence, could they, trade successfully? And, well, there is this field of turning charts into sound. It is called sonification. So, well, on the one hand, it's an interesting thing. So if, for example, the market starts moving up, then it results in a pure timbre. If it, for example, moves down, well, that's also a pure timbre. But if there are fluctuations, then the sound starts to get a bit dirty. If the market goes up, then the pitch rises. If it goes down, the pitch lowers. And accordingly, just like with a pulse, there is a kind of rhythm to this market. And theoretically, this technology also helps people with disabilities to engage in trading as well. That is, they simply hear certain musical phrases and musical rhythms. So the essence of the experiment was that 80 rats were placed, well, into specific boxes there, where they had to listen to piano melodies based on historical converted musical data, and there were two levers in that cage. So after listening, they had to press either the red or the green one, meaning either buy or sell. Well, if the rat guessed right, then they gave it some cheese. If it made a mistake, then an electric current would pass through, and, well, it learned a lesson. So, well, in the end, out of 80, only 12 remained, and then only 4 were left. That is 2 females and 2 males. Well, and they had a trading percentage higher than 50%. Well, and in this way, Markovici proved that indeed even rats can be successful traders and compete with humans and machines. Well, and then there was, a further development of this event, that the second generation was even more talented, but the third not so much. But nevertheless, when Markovici published his experiments, some folks were very interested. American hedge funds, that is, from New York and another city, right? And they offered him to buy these rats in order to experiment and make a profit. But the problem was that the rats could only work effectively for 10 minutes a day.
Uh-huh.
So if you are actually able to really train rats, then why actually can't people who want to do it work? I mean, surely there are talented people who are capable by virtue of their talents, well, to understand and feel the movement precisely as some kind of rhythmic phrase, or like, for example, people who have a rich imagination, they can, seeing charts, some images, some signals that will tell them how and when to correctly perform certain actions. Therefore, it's a creative process. And in this case, a person as a person can win against machines, but these cases are usually exceptional.
And there, as far as I remember from this story, there was a magic number 52. And in no case, well, with it, these jokes were played in completely different ways.
Well, look, if we flip a coin, right, then what we get is a win rate of about 50% chance.
Right?
Well, accordingly,
50-50.
Well, yes.
In any case.
This is provided that we flip this coin for a very long time, right? And accordingly, if, let's say, we're talking about bets that are made and the result of these bets is above 50%, then we say that this is a successful strategy. So 52% is the minimum, justified assessment of a robot. That is, if a robot can perform such functions and bring a profit of at least 52% out of 100, it's already considered effective trading.
So if it's lower, that's it. It's a failure.
Well, lower, then there's no point.
So we get 48 on one side and 52 on the other.
Yes, 48 losses, 52 wins.
Uh-huh.
So accordingly, if you, for example, put in $1,000, then after a huge number of iterations, you get 2% more.
Good. Look, now on the internet, there are a lot of builders. We have them for creating this and for creating that, and essentially work, well, in such a builder, you can assemble some product like some robot again in just a couple of mouse clicks. But you work with pure code Roman on MQL5. And can you explain to me, like I'm a 5-year-old child, what is the magic of this language? Why is serious money made through writing code and not through these visual builders? There are advantages and then again the flip side to this component.
Well, we need to differentiate a bit here. The thing is, the code can use applications that are already ready, available, and manipulate them successfully. So, for example, if you open MQL5, there are many applications there, including a huge number of free ones and a huge number of paid ones. Just like, for example, you open these apps on your phone and you can use them, whether you like them or not. But nevertheless, MQL5 actually allows you to use and take advantage of some of the results that come from the application's work, which can be quite useful. In this way, you are able to, so to speak, make your trading activities more successful and effective based on these helpful tools and features that are provided by the platform. So it turns out that this code sort of includes those libraries that you've loaded and that you can use. But nevertheless, MQL5 has many of its own tools that allow you to test and verify a huge number of your own theories, which basically everyone has and everyone wants to check, like, does this really work this way or not? In general, basically, working on MQL5 is sort of for creators, for people who have a desire to try out some of their own ideas and not just their own ideas. So you mentioned these apps, right? So why not actually, maybe it really is a winning strategy. And those apps that exist there, why not try them out? Say it costs, for example, $1,000, but how much of an effect will it bring? So everything is checked quite simply. And again, MQL5 has there are debugging tools that allow you to test any theories embedded in existing applications on a huge amount of data.
Well, yeah.
So the code and the application complement each other. They don't contradict each other.
Good. Lately I've been hearing a lot about the MetaTrader platform. MetaTrader is everywhere. MetaTrader. Roman, why has the MetaTrader platform specifically become so popular for algorithmic trading? Can you explain to me how that happened?
Well, the thing is that a platform becomes popular after a huge number of people use it. If people like it, then it turns into a tool that is necessary to realize their ideas again. And this MetaTrader platform really helps you sort of feel your strength and test your hypotheses quite easily and effectively. Because the programming language there is quite easy, and let's say it's not like it's some kind of complex thing to understand. Honestly, when you think about it, it's really just a straightforward idea that most people can easily get without much trouble. So basically, this programming language is accessible even to school children because it's logical, it's clear, and there are many libraries. Again, if, say, we take the same cell phone, right, which is designed just for talking and which is just like, well, I don't know, a gadget, then there's another cell phone, also a gadget, but with a huge number of apps that allow you to turn this phone at the same time into a camera, a photo processor, and a vast number of tools needed for life, even things like measuring, I don't know, distance and anything else you might imagine, like social networks, for example. So it's a full-fledged computer thanks to the applications. And that's why MetaTrader is exactly that sort of tool that has a huge number of different applications that help a person test their theories. In other words, a very handy tool.
What kinds of different tasks can a trader actually perform or accomplish by using MQL5, specifically in the context of trading?
Well, any kind, really. Let's think about what we actually want when we start using MetaTrader. So, well, the first thing I had, for example, was if I want to test some theory. For example, this hypothesis that if we make a lot of, say, bets, then the percentage of wins and losses will be 50%. But here a question arises. Then actually, suppose we start making bets at equal intervals of time. And then, according to our risk management strategy, what will we have as, well, we agreed not to use complex words, so when to take profit and when to take a loss. So suppose we set an equal number of points for profit and loss. And so then let's think about this. The theory that if you make many exactly identical bets, for instance, selling, just as an example, and observe that is in this scenario, we sold randomly or bought randomly. And then what will we have in the end? Will it be those 50% or will we lose everything? Well, in my case, it turned out to be a loss of about 1%. But then we can slightly adjust this idea of ours. What if we make, for example, the profit a bit larger and the loss a bit smaller, or vice versa, the loss larger and the profit smaller? So we can play around with it like a construction set and look at the whole thing from a bit of a bird's eye view. Because if we're talking about real life, not a simulator, then the loss is quite significant, and accordingly, it hits both the nervous system and the intellect. So here, in this case, this platform really provides assistance in the same way as a training center for preparation in combat conditions. In the same way, this tool helps you adapt and understand certain market laws, understand, well, the usefulness and effectiveness of mathematical tools and some other analytical capabilities that maybe, other people do not always see. Therefore, in this case, this platform is popular precisely because it has quite convenient tools and a fairly convenient language for testing your theories and hypotheses.
Is it possible to create a full-fledged trading system exclusively on MQL5?
Yes, of course, there are such examples and many articles on the internet saying that it exists, but the thing is, in those conditions, and for that person and on that instrument, it might have worked at some point. But whether it will always work is a big question. Therefore, any hypothesis must be tested. That is, yes, indeed. Well, basically, the question of whether it's a game or an art always arises. That is, this is essentially how the trading process goes, step by step. But in the end, as I mentioned before, the main and most important test is always the reality check, which MQL5 allows you to do quite effectively.
All right, Roman. So today we're discussing various issues, raising various topics, but we mustn't forget about the main fear of any beginner. I don't know code, I can't program, I have nothing to do here. The favorite broken record of many beginners. Tell me honestly, to build the first working robot, is it necessary to be an IT specialist with a degree, or can an ordinary person handle it? And what is the real entry threshold then?
Well, let's put it this way. If we imagine the youngest person who can go in there and try to do something, I think it would be a school kid. I think it would be a school kid who basically is interested in something, at least interested in something. And if a person isn't afraid, so to speak, that is, he has absolutely no fear of getting into a computer, pressing those keys, and seeing what comes of it, that's our person.
And roughly what grade schooler?
Well, basically, if we're talking about a school kid, then at least, I don't know, third grade, so there's some math involved. Because modern kids, they use cell phones and computers very actively, so adults think that this is very difficult. But children, they hit those keys in such a way that you're just amazed at where they get it from. So basically, just pressing the keys and repeating the code is something even a third grader can do. And then the question arises, strictly speaking, what to do with it. I mean, a third grader perceives it as a computer game. But is it really a computer game, or is it actually some kind of mathematical analysis? As soon as we talk about mathematical analysis, there immediately arises, there must be some kind of threshold in order to understand what you are doing, because there's already function analysis and statistics and probability theory. And in what grade is this taught? Well, that's probably high school already. But the advantage here is that if, say, you let a student see how the market works, how the MQL5 platform works, and how you can program and teach a person, say, from the third grade to write some simple, lines of code and get some results, then the person begins to touch this function and this code, and accordingly, with a huge number of parameters that already make a person think. And accordingly, when a person at school goes through, for example, the study of functions, right, there's extrema, maximums, minimums, integral calculus, differential calculus, then he will no longer just be studying this material for a grade, but he will already be thinking about how these skills can be applied, for example, in stock trading, which already becomes a tool to test the knowledge he received at school. And then we get not just schooling, math for the sake of math, for the sake of a grade, but so that this knowledge can be applied in real life, right? And then mathematics becomes alive. Well, accordingly, physics too, because a lot of models that are named and used in programming, they come from both physics and mathematics. And accordingly, it kind of comes to life there. And this is very cool because a person already begins to work as a creator. I mean, he feels that material that is invisible. What is math? What is a line? What is a circle that has neither thickness nor limits in length there? What is their rational fractions, a rational number? Moreover, the thing is that if we look, after all, in some way, the golden ratio and Fibonacci numbers play a role in the market, which, well, it would seem where from and what meaning do they have there? And there are many irrational numbers which are also somehow encrypted in there. Why they appear there, nobody knows. But that is the reality.
It makes you want to exclaim, "We're raising a generation of geniuses." Yes.
Just around the corner.
Of IT people, yes? All right. Well, here's a relatively simple question. Maybe not simple, but a logical one. How much time on average does it take to write your first simple robot? Well, give or take.
Well, for a first simple robot, again, what is a robot? It's something that can automatically buy or sell when a certain event occurs, or maybe even without an event occurring. So if, for example, we want to test this mechanism of just buying, right? We bought it and that's it, then it's elementary. As I said, a third grader could easily handle it.
Well, roughly how much time would it take? For a total beginner and for, say, a mid-level professional?
For a third grader, half an hour is enough.
And for a mid-level professional?
For older people like me? No, well, it's the same there. If it's enough for a third grader, it's enough for an average person too.
Good. The entry barrier is clear. We've got that settled. Now let's pit two worlds against each other. Let's imagine two types of people. First, a brilliant programmer, say from Google, who writes perfect code but has no idea what a trend or liquidity is. Second is an experienced trader who feels the market in his bones, but code is a total mystery to him. Which of them will create their first robot faster in this analogy? And what comes first in algo trading? Writing code masterfully or actually understanding how the market behaves and why?
Well, once again, we touched on the philosopher Epicurus earlier, who, as you might remember, was a significant figure in ancient Greek philosophy. Well,
Epicurus
had his own philosophical school and said that pleasure is the highest good. So he also had a theory, and he didn't reject the gods and consequently the muses. I find that very appealing because you're talking about, say, a Google developer and someone who feels it in their bones. It's really about what sacrifices a person makes for that muse. If you imagine the market, let's say women imagine some man, whether he's handsome or ugly, it doesn't matter, or a neurotic or whoever, and young men imagine a woman. Like a muse, when Pushkin wrote poetry, there was some kind of substance floating around that inspired him. So naturally, it's the same thing here. So if we're talking about a version of a muse that helps a person achieve certain results, then the question is, and what, strictly speaking, does a Google programmer give to this muse? What sacrifices does he make? The one who feels it in his bones, he, strictly speaking, spent this time of his for this muse. For what? I mean, is he just looking at this chart, or is he drawing some conclusions? Then accordingly, how and for what should she, this muse, reward him? Is it for understanding something, for hearing what she's actually trying to tell him, or something else? So the question is this: whether to do it mindlessly or to do it meaningfully after all. If a person feels in their bones what's happening in the market, but then the question is, what, strictly speaking, should he do then, if he feels it, to create a winning strategy? But then again, if we're talking about Comrade Epicurus, then the question arises. When the Renaissance appeared, that is, the rebirth, it was believed that man was at the head of the whole planet, yes, and the universe. So if, for example, a person wins, then it's because he's great. If he loses, then it's his fault. I mean, everyone's tearing their hair out that he couldn't do it, he failed. But if we're talking about the Greek view of the same situation, where the muse simply didn't allow it, then it means he's unworthy. And there's no need to play with this friend, for example, today. So let's meet with her tomorrow instead. So in this case, one shouldn't, as it were, go against their fate. Therefore, if a developer from Google wrote some wonderful code and the muse liked it, then he's great. If the one who's bending over backwards knows this market perfectly and well, and the muse liked him, well, then he's great.
Zeus is against it.
Yes.
Good. We've figured out what X is and what Y is, and which of them is more important. Well, let's say our viewer is now fired up with the idea, like, I want my first robot, let's say. What is his real step number one, Roman? Does he need to download the terminal right away, cram MQL5? Or is it enough to take a regular notebook and a pen and write out the code, write out his behavioral strategy there, probably, right? What should he Google? Like, what should he Google? Where should he click? And today, so let's say in a month, his first, albeit a bit clunky, but his own working robot as functional as possible, launches on his screen. What's the first real step?
Well, you're right that it's necessary to at least download this application. But we had a question before this about why it's so popular, why it's so wonderful. It's because there's a lot of documentation for MQL5 there. And accordingly, it's very convenient to use. So if a person wants to create their first robot, they just open the manual for MQL5. And he can insert his code that very same day and get his first trading robot instantly. Because the documentation is just wonderful. It's in English, it's in Russian, and so a person feels great support, and if they want to figure it out, then they move forward, with a majestic stride into the arms of their muse.
Okay, let's imagine a classic scenario. In demo, a strategy promises a life of luxury, but with real money, it burns the deposit in a week. Yet manually, the trader somehow managed to earn using that same system. Why does that happen? Is the algorithm poorly authorized, automated, or did the manual trader just unconsciously trade on intuition, which simply cannot be digitized?
Well, you have to understand these things. We're talking about intuition, we're talking about digitization. Look here. If we take, for example, the market, well, I don't know, there's the metals market, there's the stock market, for instance, there's the currency market, and accordingly, the question arises about the strategy, what to do. So, and if we take, for example, let's say a market that relies on daily indicators, right, then there's actually a fairly powerful influence from the news. If we say base the market on 1 minute or 5 minute indicators, then there's a lot of noise, a considerable amount of random fluctuations, and it becomes much harder to distinguish meaningful trends from all that background activity. And the question arises how best to analyze, how to apply this robot, and specifically on which time periods to use it. That is, if, say, a person succeeded in trading on certain periods and another one took it and tried to extrapolate it to some others, then naturally he will have a
fiasco.
Right. Because naturally news influences have a fairly strong impact on trading. And what was, for example, a year ago for this robot and what is now are two big differences. And accordingly, the conditions change. And as I said at the beginning, the participation of robots in trading changes things quite a bit and makes it nervous and unpredictable, the results of this very trading. Because if, say, everyone predicts a trend, everyone predicts the market based on a strategy that worked a year ago, then now it should a priori already be loss-making, because everything has changed and accordingly the market has adjusted, restructured, and everything has become completely different. And in this sense, adaptability is, as it were, tested constantly and constantly and constantly there. And to say, oh, well, look at that, it worked for him a year ago, but now it doesn't. Yes, that's how it should be.
Well, okay, interesting. You probably often have traders or experts from various fields coming to you for help, right? To develop something. What's the wildest story or most overcomplicated idea you've ever been asked to code? Maybe you can recall such an instance. Why are these multi-layered ideas, which seem brilliant to clients, absolutely lifeless and unviable in practice? Or maybe you could tell us about your biggest disappointment as a developer. Maybe you had a situation where you came up with something or noticed a mathematically brilliant idea, but when you started coding it, MQL5 told you this idea is turning to dust. What was that all about?
I see. There was one fellow who said, oh, why not actually? Let's look at how many interesting and good indicators there are. And mostly people use, well, usually from 3 to 5 indicators, which allow them to draw conclusions about a trading strategy. But let's put 100 of them into our model, and that way we'll have a guaranteed advantage over all the other robots, right? But if we analyze this option, then it turns out to be like, I don't know, like a string of 100 light bulbs. And then the assumption is that if they all light up, then we'll say, yes, we're buying, for example, right? And when they all go out, we'll say, we're selling all of this. Well, first of all, there's an immediate violation of risk management here. And secondly, the idea itself, well, it seems interesting, but the thing is, as soon as we talk about the market and statistics, we're saying that all the bulbs could theoretically light up. But that would happen, well, maybe not once in 100 years, but let's say once a month sometime, yeah, right? Mostly the bulbs are either half lit or some go out entirely, yet it ends up being like a series of gates. That is, all the gates, if we suppose we have 100 gates in a row and they're closed, right, and a rider or a car is speeding along, what's the probability that all the gates will open simultaneously so the car can fly through without hitting a single closed gate? So the probability is very small. And I had to spend a long time explaining to the person that we'd never see the event, where all 100 indicators he planned to build would be working at once, right? So, well, nevertheless, the person was thinking about it. I mean, this thought occurred to him, and that's actually great. The fact that some theories and assumptions arise, well, it shows that the person is a creator, and that's great. And I think it's not just an adult who can think about this. I think that children, just like adults, can also ask the very same kinds of questions. And as I mentioned before, it would definitely be useful and beneficial in schools. And when you consider a discipline such as stock trading and, well, its application and how it can be tested, then I think children would be no worse, as traders than adults.
Interesting.
Moreover, I think that girls with their emotional perception and prophetic dreams or whatever could also participate here in some way, because very often it's precisely those patterns that emerge and are key to creating a correct, successful strategy. They can help, so to speak, in emotional perception, in the emotional state. Therefore, those traders who have girlfriends and wives are in a more advantageous position.
Well, it's like some kind of parallel universe. Well, okay. As you know, in any terminal, there is a strategy tester button. A beginner runs their bot on some history from the past year, let's say, right? Sees a beautiful, impressive upward yield curve, opens a bottle of champagne to celebrate, and brings in some real money. But why, you might wonder, is the historical strategy tester the biggest liar in algorithmic trading? To what extent does this beautiful picture from the past guarantee him profit tomorrow?
It absolutely does not guarantee it. Like I said, it's a muse. If she likes this person, she will give him a chance to win.
How prosaic everything is in our world.
Well, in fact, what happened a year ago and all the historical data from before might not work at all now. Because as I say, the market changes completely and its strategies, its laws, they are volatile. These are not some static things and functions that repeat over and over. There is definitely some repeatability here, but the thing is, if we look again at this kind of music that is created when you sonify these charts, it might become retro at some point, but even then, it will only be for a very brief moment. And when you tested this on historical data, you actually managed to catch a sort of strategy. It must be said that there is, for example, at least for now, machine learning involved, that is neuroprogramming. And there, specifically, just like for training animals, as we mentioned earlier, there are pattern variants and how, well, I can definitely tell you a little bit about that. So there is a mathematical theory, such as, for example, what is called Markov chains. Google actually uses this theory exactly when you type, for example, some word in a search engine, and after typing two letters, you immediately see either the whole word, that you mean, or the next letter, right? So there is a probability of an event occurring based on past occurrences. For instance, when you type two letters, the third one is most likely to be this one. So Google actually suggests the letter that, statistically speaking, should most likely appear next based on the vast number of phrases typed in by other people over time. And it is exactly the same with charts. When we run it through machine learning, what we are essentially doing is making the assumption that if, for example, this particular event followed this one, and then this one happened, and then this one occurred as well, we are able to observe a pattern that might in fact repeat itself with a certain probability. So neuroprogramming is actually quite advantageous and beneficial in this specific case, providing us with a significant edge, and it really helps to avoid problems in many situations. Those patterns from a year ago and helps adapt our strategy to the data coming in today.
In algo trading, there is a scary term, over optimization or curve fitting. Can you explain simply how a trader can tell if they have built a brilliant bot or just fitted parameters to past charts?
Well, I can say that MQL5 is very good precisely because it offers a huge variety of different data and various charts to experiment with. So saying it fits them to old data is practically impossible there because you would have to input the entire history, say 5 million data points. And we know for sure that, for example, 495th follows 494th. But if we want to understand the pulse of trading, if we want to grasp the patterns that emerge, that does not help. So MQL5 is a great training tool in this case, allowing you to test all your strategies. Regarding over optimization, I have said that using, say, 100 indicators together is a form of over optimization. It seems like we are making a sure move if all those 100 stars align, and then luck will surely shine on us. But that does not work either. So here it is precisely. The beauty of it is that it is fluid, unstable, not rote. It does not mean you have found a 3, a 7, and an ace and will definitely hit the jackpot. So there is very interesting analytical work involved because it is about statistics and probability, and it is quite captivating. And if a person, for instance, programs, then they can test their theories because, well, it's interesting. After all, as my colleagues have told me, the recent students who came and whom I met from Tomsk University, they said that the math professors are quite well-off people because they are constantly working in trading and they are constantly testing their theories. That is, mathematicians, professors who have a lot of knowledge, who can test their knowledge and also make money from it. But that's just wonderful.
So they shouldn't be allowed into Las Vegas anymore?
Well, I don't know. We'll have to see.
Right, okay. And let's give our viewers and listeners some kind of safety checklist, right? So a person wrote some code and they like it. And before giving this robot the password to your real account with real thousands of dollars, What kind of purgatory should it go through? Maybe a month on a demo account or forward testing? What is the most rigorous testing algorithm in this case?
Goodness, well, first you need to naturally check on historical data provided by MQL5, which is a standard tool. Now, if everything works out for it and there's good data and good results, well, then why not give it a try? So we were saying that most importantly, you have to please the muse who has seen that quite a lot of time has been spent on study, quite a lot of time has been spent on testing all your theories, on studying this subject in general, on understanding at least the matters that the person wants to manifest. And then the strategy will indeed be a winning one. And then, provided that on historical data and what happened in the past works out, then accordingly the tips work quite successfully. Then there's every chance that you can bring even $1 million, test it, and most likely everything will be fine and wonderful.
But what if a beginner hasn't over-optimized the code? The strategy's fine, right? But they forgot about such boring things as spread widening during news or the broker's commission, slippage, and strict risk management. How quickly does the market punish for these technical details that seem unimportant to a beginner in the tester?
For a beginner, well, beginners are lucky. So they might not even need it at all, and everything will be wonderful and fine. But over time, again, we are talking about statistics. So if a beginner gets lucky at first and everything's great and they're just in total euphoria, they think they're just so great and wonderful that everything they're told is nonsense, and they'll believe that they're just a lucky person while everyone else is just not very good. Right. So life ends up punishing them later on. And naturally, if they ignore like these simple rules of risk management and consequently what they should be paying attention to, well, then I doubt they have much of a future.
Well, not everyone, but many know about this beginner's syndrome where a person tries to cram into a single robot 15 indicators, do volume analysis, neural networks, and moon phases, hoping that it'll be more reliable. Why does this, let's say, Frankenstein effect work in algorithmic trading? The more complex the monster is, the faster it breaks down. So, can you explain, Roman, why professionals often trade using very simple algorithms? I mean, there are the rookies, right, who stress out and overcomplicate things, while these experienced professionals don't really spend that much time on it. They already know their strategy clearly.
I like that part about the moon phases. Yes, there actually is a dependency, a weak correlation, of course, between market movement and the moon phases, but that's just, it's mostly brought up as a joke, of course. Right. And as for simple code, well, look, if you have a huge number of libraries, or as we say, there are applications in MQL5, both paid and free, and you use them, then with a single line of code, you can manipulate data from a massive, massive number of lines of code that perform a giant volume of analysis, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. So, yes, indeed, a few lines of code can seem very simple, and nobody knows what's actually going on under the hood. It's like a person can show off, like, oh, look what I've achieved, right? But in reality, it's a massive, massive amount of work by them or by other people, right? So the beauty of the code doesn't necessarily mean that it's simple.
What about the moons?
The moon, well,
I can't get it out of my head now.
it might not be just the moon, but solar flares as well. And there could be, well, by the way, not just solar flares. The thing is, there actually are studies besides the moon phases, about how the market is affected by, for example, Google searches, like which stocks to buy and which ones to sell. And the frequency of those searches really does affect the trading chart. And besides that, consequently, well, news is obvious. And modern, models, modern methods of analysis and forecasting really do take news feeds into account. And there's even an expansive field for experimentation here regarding how the market is influenced by factors that we might not even realize. So, all joking aside, this is actually a quite serious subject for study.
All right. As we know, artificial intelligence is very popular right now. It's everywhere, in everything. It's all encompassing. How strongly does artificial intelligence influence algorithmic trading today?
Very strongly. That's because if we're talking about AI, if we're talking about neural models, that's also part of machine learning and therefore AI. In other words, fairly large firms can't do without AI, spending huge sums to get information and recommendations from this specific tool. Um, well, because information that, as we mentioned, has a weak correlation can somehow influence market behavior and consequently the probabilistic characteristics that arise during trading. It's one thing when you're trading $100, but it's another thing when you have several billion there. And then the cost of a mistake is quite high. And that's why artificial intelligence is a very important tool for trading in this context. Very important, especially for large sums. But it's a huge investment. It takes very huge resources to utilize artificial intelligence. It's a truly massive, so to speak, and significant software challenge as well. Just to be clear, it's a huge task and even an energy intensive one because so much energy is consumed just to make a single decision. Very few organizations can actually be able to afford this. Those that truly and genuinely, let's say, have very large funds at their disposal.
Well, listen. So there's a guy sitting at home with a laptop writing a bot while giant funds are playing against him. They have data centers right in the exchange building, ping 0 millisecond ping, and a staff of PhDs in mathematics. Does a private trader with MetaTrader even have a chance in this meat grinder? What could be our advantage over these financial monsters in this case?
Well, there have already been several mentions here regarding artificial intelligence. Accordingly, if a person uses this data, meaning specific AI recommendations on how to solve a problem, and consequently listens to the AI's advice, provided they made the right query and fully described the problem, provided he truly understands this topic, then a rather interesting and perhaps even unexpected answer can result, which might not even, let's say, occur to a human being. Therefore, this tool is very important. As for other funds, well, look, if we, for example, talk about funds that have a huge amount of capital, then the question arises as to how their trading is conducted. If they use news, then it happens, over fairly long time periods. That is, these will be both daily and monthly periods. If we look at the charts, of stocks, which are usually American, growing quite strongly, or something happens to them, low volatility, then it's either, for example, let's take metals at least. Yes, that is, if we invest in the metals market, there are also guaranteed profits there that save from any failures. And then in this case, more stable trading results. But if a person directly, conducts analytics themselves and in their own comfortable period, that is the movement of the chart, then it turns out he finds that very comfortable environment in which he succeeds. And those funds that trade on different periods, either short or very long ones, they are not really his competitors in this sense. And he can try out his theory, and most likely he will even succeed, and everything will be good and great.
As a developer and creator of the MQL5 ecosystem products, tell me, how do you see algo trading in 3 to 5 years, maybe 10? Will MQL5 remain the industry standard for private individuals? Or will we all switch to voice controls and create working robots in seconds and either earn or lose?
What will happen in 10 years? Absolutely no one can say because now, for example, we have Android, we have iOS. And whether this will continue or if another operating system and some other ways of communication will emerge, no one knows either. Therefore, looking into the future, well, here probably one should read some futuristic novels. As for MQL5 developing, yes, there are chances, there is potential, and accordingly, as a tool, it is very good and reliable. And I think that it will most likely remain because, in the same way, if you look back, yes, Excel, Word, how many years they've been around, and yet we use them, they develop in various forms. There are also Linux versions available. But nevertheless, these tools remain with us.
If, Roman, you had the opportunity to send a brief but meaningful telegram message to yourself on the very day when you first made the important decision to get into the world of algorithmic trading, what would you say to your past self in that moment? What one? What's the single most important piece of advice you'd give yourself? What would you write to save a lot of money and stress?
Saving a lot of money and stress is impossible because it is sort of the flip side of the movement. I mean, if you only have ups and no downs at all, then you won't be able to make any corrections whatsoever. So, well, that's how a person actually learns to walk. And if I went back to that same time, I'd say, well done, you're doing everything right, you're looking in the right direction, and it's very interesting, it's very cool, and you're applying your knowledge well, so just keep going.
Ordinary. Well, okay. Algorithmic trading isn't magic, and it's not a button to make money. It's a way to look at the market as a system where every decision must be clearly described, verified, and tested. And perhaps the main paradox of algorithmic trading is that when you start writing robots, you begin to understand the market itself much more deeply. Today we talked about how trading algorithms are created, how the MQL5 language works, and how you can start your journey in algorithmic trading. Roman, thank you very much for such an interesting conversation, which was informative for our listeners. And to everyone listening or watching the xChief Central Asia podcast, I want to say one thing. Sometimes the best way to understand the market is to try to explain it to a machine. If this episode was useful to you, support it with a like and subscribe. And in the comments, write whether you're ready to trust your money to a trading algorithm right now, or if you only trust yourself for now. We'll leave all the useful links in the description of this video. Mikhail was with you. See you in the next episodes of the xChief Central Asia podcast. Listen to us on all platforms.